I'm David Manti, and with me today is Lezli Engelking with Focus, the foundation of Cannabis Unified Standards. Thank you very much for joining me today, Lezli.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, if you could start off by telling me a little bit about Focus, and I guess what you guys focus on. Oh, I got a pun in there right away. No.
Yes, it was intentional. So Focus is a 501c3 not-for-profit cannabis health and safety organization. When I got into the cannabis industry coming out of the pharmaceutical world, I actually opened the first chain of vertically integrated licenses in Phoenix, Arizona, where I'm from. And during the 2.5 years that I was there, we grew very quickly. We're very successful, but realized that we desperately needed some business help, that, standards aren't in every industry, and this industry wasn't going to go anywhere without them either. So I left and sold all my financial interests to start Focus as a 501c3 health and safety nonprofit organization for the cannabis industry. We write standards and provide third-party certification to those standards. We also do consulting work and application work and government work, stuff like that. So anything really, we're here to help. Our mission is to protect public health, consumer safety, and the environment by promoting integrity in the cannabis industry. So we pretty much do anything we can to kind of follow that along and help things move forward in the industry.
What did you see, sort of based on your experience in the pharmaceutical industry, what did you see that was sort of lacking when it came to like cannabis-specific good manufacturing practices?
Well, so in any industry that, like if you look at food or pharma or devices, the federal agencies that are responsible for licensing those operators provide good manufacturing practice guidelines. But because cannabis has come up in the US at the state level with no federal involvement, the states have designed these regulations. And so we don't have any of those, which is why we see such a heavy emphasis on testing and third-party testing in this industry, right? Because they did not put any requirements in for quality assurance beforehand, for doing some in-house good manufacturing practices, checks and balances to assure that you're doing what you think you're doing, and that presents and creates the right product. So everything from food safety regulations to OSHA regulations to how to properly handle a recall and assure that everybody's safe if the product does get to market that's not safe. It's literally everything. The standards cover everything from top to bottom. So they're a management system standard like an ISO 9001, but they're just specific to the cannabis industry. And so really all of it as a whole, it teaches the company to put together a management system so that all of their documentation and all of their processes are all built into one plan, so that if something goes wrong, they can go back and check what happened, why, fix the problem, prevent it from happening again. What you see a lot, and what I saw back then, to get more specific on your answer, is people are drinking out of a fire hose in this industry all the time. It's literally, one emergency to the next. And we did the same. And so that was what I was really trying to do, is build a partnership to help these businesses build their business into what they want it to be, to give them the tools they need to succeed and scale, and that sort of thing.
So I read that you were established in 2014 as a result of those shortcomings you mentioned in quality, safety, and consistency. So what did you, when you started everything, what were some of those things that you saw that you're just like, there are red flags everywhere?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give you examples from our business just because I'm not calling anybody out and I know them firsthand. But I mean, it could be anything. So we went from single digit employees to triple digit employees in a matter of 2 months. Without any hiring practices that were written down, without any standard operating procedures or training materials that were for these employees. It was chaos. So that's just a very simple one. We were having turnover all the time with our employees because we weren't training them well and we weren't engaging them, and then they would leave, which costs a fortune in this industry just due to the agent cards and things that they have to get. So that was part of it. But even from an operations standpoint in the grow, I mean, we had so many different issues. One, like the AC went out, and we're in Arizona, so that's a very, very big part of what we do. We didn't have an SOP in place for what happens when that happens. We didn't have anybody on call to get that call. So the director at the cultivation facility didn't hear it. It was, 12 hours before we knew it, and we lost hundreds of thousands of dollars for that wholesale room. Another time we had white flies or spider mites that were on the plants, and we had to destroy the whole room, clean it, sanitize everything, put all the new clones back in, and a few days later, here's all these little white flies again. Same whole process again, same thing, until somebody realized, well, we didn't actually clean the air filter out. And so every time we clean this room, we're just blowing all that contamination back into the room. So it's just attention to detail and putting preventative practices in place so that when something goes wrong, because it always will, that you know how to handle it. It doesn't really do much damage to your business. You've got a plan for how to get back on track, that kind of thing.
So what was the company, and is it still around?
Yes, it was. But I left there before I started Focus. And it's Bloom Dispensaries.
Okay.
And they're much bigger now and doing great. So that's good.
What initially drew you to the industry?
Nothing. That's the wrong answer. No, I was kind of pulled in reluctantly. Honestly, I had left Eli Lilly and Company. I'd been there almost 13 years and just recently gotten a divorce, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I was going to just take 6 months and sort of figure out my next path. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. I honestly was going to go into something involving horse racing, but that's another whole thing. But some friends, Arizona had just legalized for medical here, and a close friend of mine wanted to apply for a license and had some people with him and the financial backing. And they said, we'd really like you to be the applicant, just, based on your background and your history and quality and safety and that kind of stuff. And so they really had to wear me down and talk me into it. But they did such a good job. And they did it through data and patient stories. And honestly, by, within 2 months and we opened our doors, it was like, I was sold. Just completely convinced about this plant and the benefit. I mean, I would hear stories as we opened our first dispensary, and I'd be out there talking to patients and making sure everything was just flowing properly. And, I remember the first day we opened, we had this cute little couple from Minnesota. He's in his 80s, she's in her 70s. They moved here because it was illegal there, and they'd both been using it. He's a veteran, she's got fibro, all their kids are there, but they came here to live, and they were just so happy. Like, it just changed their whole life. He wasn't in pain anymore. They could do things. And so I've just been a believer ever since. I just trying to figure out the right way to do this so that we can actually call it medicine and it could meet the standards required for medicine. But also, keep all the nuances of the industry and the history of the community and stuff in there too.
So at what point did you kind of step back and tell yourself that you needed to step away from Bloom to sort of serve the greater good?
It's an interest. It was a progression. It wasn't just one day. I had started talking about this, because once I realized the problems we were having, all my friends, my new friends in the industry were having similar problems. And I just started talking to people. I talked to Marijuana Policy Project. I talked to NCIA, different groups that would have possibly done something like this. And at the time, they didn't have the bandwidth or the interest in doing it. They were trying to run their own associations and said, more power to you, Lezli, go ahead. And so once I kind of realized that there was no one else doing it and that I knew we needed it, it was just a matter of time. And some stuff were happening at Bloom where it was just a good time for me to go. We had brought on a new business partner and sort of were transitioning. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to just take a few months, do some research, figure out how to do this and do it.
Okay.
So it was a long time ago, and it was very different when I did that, though, right? I mean, the industry was even in 2014, it was still, people were still so afraid of raids and things were just really getting started. And so, it was needed. And I figured I've got the firsthand experience and the pharma experience, public health stuff. So
do you have, some stories of sort of the standards that you've helped create have helped transform other cultivators, operators, and how they've sort of fix some of those problems that you suffered from at Bloom?
I mean, that's all we do for everybody. But I will say, we had a client here in Arizona, one of our very few. We don't do a lot of work in Arizona, interestingly, but wanted to sell their business. And there were 2 other licenses in the state that were for sale. And a couple big MSOs were in looking at them and trying to decide between the 3. And they chose the one they chose because they had everything in a box. It was a business in a box that they could absolutely walk in and run. They had all their, documentation in place. There was transparency throughout all the operations. Contracting was done and in place, supplier qualification. So, I think that's probably the biggest testament to this is that, wow, your business becomes more valuable. But I think there's so many things that we prevent from happening that are really difficult to measure, right? Like our job is to prevent something. So if it happens, that's not a good thing.
Right.
We get called in a lot of times when something bad happens.
Yeah. How can we make sure this never happens again?
Yeah, so that's what it is. That's what certification is. It's literally top to bottom of your business, going through and saying, what are the risks? How do we mitigate them? And what happens if they happen anyway? What's our plan then? And we literally do that from how they manage, to how they hire, to how they train, to their operations, to their marketing, to their security, to their waste, health and safety, all of it. So it really is just that process of like, we're trying to prevent this. Ultimately you see, I was trying to think of a recent story. I think it was this week that, Hot Pockets, those like,
oh yeah, the glass shards and Hot Pockets. Yeah.
Yeah. But it was like, a ton of them. That was not a small recall, right? But
No, it
a
was
lot of companies,
yeah.
if that happens in cannabis, don't have any system in place to do that recall. And time is of the essence. So it's something that has to be planned in advance. You need to have your on-call recall team ready to go, knowing what their role is before that happens. So things like that. But it also, how many explosions do we hear about in extraction labs, right? And some of them licensed, some of them not. But again, if those processes and the equipment and the rooms had all been checked and verified that the SOPs did what they were supposed to do and protected what they were supposed to protect, we wouldn't see those things. And if you did, it's because somebody varied off the process, and we'd be able to identify why it happened and prevent it from happening again.
So in your experience, what's the procedure before these bad things happen? Is it people operating on, like their best intentions or wishful thinking, and then all of a sudden, there's an explosion or there's a safety problem or a recall? Is it just that they don't have the foresight to envision such a thing happening?
I think that's definitely a big part of it. If you think about it, like just to write down all the standards and get, standards to cover the supply chain of the industry, right? From, cultivation on down to testing and distribution and retail. It took us 3 years with over 200 experts to figure out what that needed to look like, to pull from OSHA, to pull from, the Food Safety Modernization Act, to pull from FDA food code or pharma, and get all that in place. So it is a lot to manage. And cannabis is unique in the sense that it hits a lot of different categories. So for food safety, if it was just food, it'd be pretty straightforward, right? But it hits so many different areas that I think that. So I do think it's a lot. I also think, and this was, part of why I started Focus, for me, we were a small business, put all our life savings into this, really excited to get it going. It takes so much to get a license, right? You spend so much money and time and energy and resources before you ever get the license. Then you get the license and it's boom, hit the ground. You got 6 months or something to get it running, whatever this, state is. So I think that the way the system works, it sort of, it pushes towards this, right? It makes it more likely that we have these issues. So I think that's part of it. I also think, especially early on, people were, the first people to apply for these licenses tended to be people that liked cannabis, that had a history with the plant of some kind or another, not necessarily people that are business people that have run a bunch of different companies and stuff. And so all the logistical stuff, all the regulatory stuff becomes a lot, and there's a lot. And so I think a lot of it is just, they don't understand all the things that could go wrong. There's certainly some owners out there that that just don't care, right? They're
Yeah.
in it to make a buck as quick as they can and get out of this space, after they do, and they really are not that bothered. But
Mhm.
in general, that is not my opinion of the industry. I mean, I
Mhm.
think people are trying to do well. I also think that there's a lot of, I don't know if it's marketing but press, and there's a lot of attention around applications, right? But you hear about people who write applications in this space, and they write applications and they call it the application world or la la land, right?
Mhm.
So they're writing an application for a client to get a license. They're
Mhm.
not writing down how to run their business,
Right.
even though they're writing a business plan and a waste management plan and a safety plan. And so I think that really does a disservice to people in this industry too. It's really the reason we started writing applications. We didn't want to, but if we write an application and you win that license, the day you get that license, you've got a week by week plan of what you're going to do to get open in 6 months. You know who you need to order from when. It's all, so I think some of it is people don't get set up for success from the get-go too.
Mhm. So what does that plan look like? For somebody that's just starting out, when they're working with you, and sort of this step by step, what is like a high level look at that plan?
So it varies obviously based on what you're doing.
Mhm.
If it's a cultivation or a grow or a retail, right? And so, but it basically, so it could be different, but all of it is basically working backwards from the start date, right? So we've gone, okay, here's all the stuff we need to do. Let's put them in the hierarchical order. So if it's, a build out of a retail facility, they need to order millwork early and get, that kind of stuff done, like the architectural stuff. It just is prioritizing things for them. So what they end up with is, week one, you've got your license. Okay, here's what you have to go do at the city and get your zoning stuff finished and do this. And here, blah, 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 sign the leases, start paying your employees, get them on payroll. Like, it just depends kind of on the client and the type of operation. But whatever it is from top to bottom. The other thing is when we're writing standard operating procedures, we're not writing them for anybody. We're writing them for that facility, for their equipment, those kind of things. So they don't have to turn around and go buy a bunch more SOPs or try and rewrite them once they get their facility and license going. They could just put them in and go through them and validate that they do what they're supposed to do.
Okay. One of the things it did. And I was gonna ask, because you had, the information that you had sent previously said that, you had no financial stake and no funding from the cannabis industry. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how that sets you apart, but then also how do you make money?
Yep. It's a great question. And people ask it all the time. It is probably one of the most unique things about Focus. I am not aware from my decade in this space of anybody else that can say that. What that means is we did not take on investment money. So when I started this company, I sold all my financial stake in the dispensary chain that I was running and took that money to start Focus. And then I used my 401k and stuff like that. My intent was to take on investment. And we were very fortunate that we had lots of talks with lots of people that offered. Unfortunately, what we found is everybody that understood the value of what I was trying to build already saw the value of this industry and had a stake in it. And I knew that if we had a financial tie to the industry, it would jeopardize our integrity. I mean, I think about coming from pharma, and there'd be a great study that comes out, right? And it's a double-blind, placebo-controlled, gold standard type study, but Pfizer sponsored it or Lilly sponsored it. And then people kind of poo-poo the data because they don't believe it. I did not want anybody to be able to do that with Focus. It was important to me that, we could remain independent and third party and all of that. So it's been built on, a wish and a prayer and a lot of sweat equity and good nature and volunteers. And we don't take any funding. Our money comes in. So we have the nonprofit, we provide certification, training, education. We work with governments. And those are all for-profit services, like they're through the nonprofit though.
Okay.
So that's how the nonprofit gets paid, is working directly with operators and stuff. Obviously we take donations too, but
Okay.
But we do have a for-profit company. Now, it's not my company. I'm not even on it. And it's just a sister company that will do like application writing and consulting. And we do that just because it's a conflict of interest for us to do both. If
Right.
we come and get your business ready for certification, and then we come back out and to certify and say you're not ready, whose fault is it? It's ours, right? So
Right.
we have to keep that separate. And that's a really big deal for international accreditation. So we've been working on trying to get accredited to ISO 17065 for the past couple of years. And we're just finishing that, but that's part of the reason, because we can't have any conflict between what we do.
Okay.
So like, that's why I said kind of the writing applications, consulting, it really wasn't what I intended to do. But once we got into the space and we wrote the standards and we published them and we tried to put them in the market, we realized that the industry just really wasn't there and they needed some guidance on how to get there.
Okay. What is the specific ISO standard that you were just mentioning?
17065.
Mhm.
And it is for certification bodies. So it's the same accreditation that like an SGS would have, or any of the big global certification bodies. It's the same accreditation that ASTM has, that, you know, all these other organizations. So it's just, we'll be the first organization that's only cannabis that has this in the world.
Okay. I found it interesting that your business model is based off of experience or information taken from methadone clinics during the heroin epidemic in the 90s. Could you
I know,
talk
right?
a little bit about that? Yeah.
Yeah, of course. It's funny. When early on, I had a business partner early on that we separated ways, but he was so adamant that he didn't want me to talk about that publicly, that he didn't want me sharing that. He's like, that's methadone, and we're not trying to like associate cannabis with that and heroin and blah, blah, blah. And from an advocacy perspective, I understand that. But the reason that I followed that is because when I was looking for is just some business model, right? I knew I had the information from the industry. I knew they had the health and safety and quality information. I just didn't know how to start a certification body and write standards. So I was looking at things like JCO, the hospital accreditation, and different kind of similar business models. And none of them really seemed to fit. And then I came across CARF, and CARF is, it's a terrible, terrible name. It's Commission on Accreditation of Rehabilitation Facilities, CARF, CARF. So they're really interesting to me because they've been around since the 60s. And in the heroin epidemic, when it's, you know, problems start sweeping across the country, within 2 years, methadone clinics had popped up. They were operating in every state under all different local and state regs with no federal oversight. So it's just like cannabis, right? And so I was like, well, how did they get from there to where we are today? Well, as it turns out, SAMHSA, through the Department of Health and Human Services, decided to contract with the Institute of Medicine to do a study to look at the best way to regulate these methadone clinics. And that study, once it was published, came out, said that they were looking for one organization that was a 501c3 nonprofit that would serve everybody, local, state, and federal, that would write voluntary consensus standards, provide third-party certification and training for these methadone clinics. Flash forward 2 years, it turned into RFP, a request for proposal from SAMHSA and the federal government, and CARF is the organization that answered and won that RFP. They are still under contract to provide all those services nationally as well as globally today. So it turns out they're in Tucson, which is like an hour and a half from me. And after a lot of digging, I was able to find some people that actually were employed with CARF and on the committee that responded to that RFP and built their program. So I had spent some time working with them when I was writing my business model and, you know, just asking questions. So the model is about the same. We built a nonprofit. We built voluntary consensus standards because those are the only kind that can be adopted into federal regs. We did third-party certification and training. The only real difference is there's no federal RFP in place today. But everything that we've done since day one has been trying to set that path so that when there is, we meet those needs.
Mm-hmm. Is there anyone else in the game that would be considered for that? Or, I mean, based on a lot of the people that I've spoken to, your name or focus is always what comes up first. So I was just kind of curious, is that like, I mean, not that it's going to be rubber stamped or anything, but is
No,
that something?
no, and I don't do it. I would never do kind of predictions. But when I started this, there was no one, and up until 2017, really nobody had even written standards. Americans for Safe Access tried to write some for patients, but it was much more about how to give patients good care than it was how to run a cannabis business. So those kind of actually don't even know if they're still around today. In 2017, ASTM got involved, and I don't know how familiar you are, but they're one of the oldest standards organizations in the world. And so they reached out and said, hey, we'd had some members want to talk about developing cannabis standards. We're willing to entertain it. Do you want to talk? And so we flew out to DC and met with them for a few days and kind of just a small group, and decided, to move forward. So up until 2017, there was nobody other than me. And then there's ASTM, and we actually signed a derivative works license with them. So we gave them our standards so they could develop further standards. So because ours are a management system, they cover everything. What ASTM has been developing is these little standards that go within that. So in focus standards, it would say for food safety, you need to have a HACCP plan. They wrote a standard for cannabis HACCP plans. So they continue to develop those, but there's still nobody that has comprehensive standards out there that cover the supply chain like ours do.
Okay. It says that you worked for 2.5 years with 300 volunteers to finally publish the standards. What was that first 2.5 year period like?
Oh gosh. So fun. First of all, like standard development was so fun. At first it was really hard though, like trying to get a committee. So the whole process goes back to voluntary consensus. And as I said, those are the type of standards that can be adopted into regulations, but they also are important because it's very much about how they're developed, who develops them, the process that's used, right? So they have to all be volunteers. So there's no, quid pro quo. You have to have balanced stakeholder input, which means I couldn't just get a bunch of cannabis business owners in a room. I had to balance that equally with other stakeholder groups. But in 2014, it was really hard to find an attorney or, a banker or whatever, people that wanted to be involved, have their name involved with cannabis. In fact, we had some great people that started on our standards development committees that that eventually came back and said, you know what, I can't have my name on your website. It's affecting my other business, So it was challenging to find the right people back then. Once we got going and we're sort of a year into it and had published a little bit about it, it had gotten a lot better. And certainly today, that's not an issue like it was. But it was great. So what we did not recreate the wheel. We decided that cannabis is not a unicorn, even though it hits so many different areas, and that we were just going to do everything we could to compile that information from the different areas and put it into a standard, which is where the OSHA and the FSMA and all that kind of stuff come in. So we pulled all that information and put them into what we called foundational checklists. It was just a huge document. We only called it foundational because you could build a house on it. There was so many pages. And then each committee member would receive that packet of information and go through it. And they would each month have to read through a different section or two and comment on what they wanted to change and improve or remove. And then they would get on a call and discuss this and then vote on what should take place. So there's the consensus and the voluntary and all of that. So it takes a long time, but I have to say those calls we had 8 committees in the beginning. So we had cultivation, extraction, infused products, retail, laboratory, and then security, sustainability, and packaging and labeling. One of the processes that you have to go through when you develop voluntary consensus standards is a public review. So you have to put everything out for 30 days, take the comments, and then the committee goes back through them and decides what to do. So through our public comment period, we got some great feedback. One is that extraction and infused products should just be manufacturing, and that those standards were similar enough that they could just be combined. So we did that. The other was that security, sustainability, and packaging and labeling are really different requirements for a cultivator than a retailer. And
Right.
so those 3 standards were taken apart and put into each of the primary standards. So what we end up with is a cultivation, manufacturing, retail, or lab certification. All of them contain, packaging and labeling, security, and sustainability requirements specific to that.
So over the last 3 years, ever since they were published, what was the initial response and how has adoption been?
So when we finally finished them, we decided to do an international pilot program, and we were going to give away 5 certifications to any cannabis business, and we published the standards, and we did these announcements, and we had all these calls. And after about 20 calls, we realized that this was not going to work, that nobody was ready to meet the standards, which was, it was a little bit like when I first started talking about focus in 2014 at industry conferences. People were like, I felt like I had a target on my back when I got down, because people thought she's trying to overregulate us. She's trying to, put more requirements, and really, didn't understand. And so it was a key learning for me to step back and say, hey, we need to talk about the difference between standards and regs and laws, and how standards help industry and that. And that was kind of the same thing with the pilot program. So through getting that feedback, we developed comprehensive standard operating procedures and guidance documents that go with the standards, set up an online repository so each client gets their own document library where they upload all their docs, it tracks them and completes the metadata for them so that they, when things change, it's all up to date and all of that. So we just kind of went back to the drawing board for the next, year and a half. We were still working with some clients, but, and then we brought those out. And so we've been offering certification for the last, year and a half, 2 years.
Okay.
But so we applied, I should have started here. There's a little out of order. I apologize. But when I started this, I knew I wanted our standards to be legitimate and, fit in with the rest of the world. And so we applied to the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, to accredit our standards. And we started working with them. And then a few months into it, they came back and said, it's cannabis, it's federally illegal, we're not comfortable. Yeah. So we were really fortunate, because in 2019, they came back to us and said, you know what, you were right, the world needs focus, and we're willing to accredit you now as the certifying body for these cannabis certifications. So ever since that happened, we are getting people ready for certification, but we have not actually gone out and issued a certificate because it doesn't make sense. It would just be much more valuable to our client from the certificate point of view. We still get them ready because they get all the actual real protections and risk management benefits from day one, but that we are waiting. So as soon as we announce this accreditation, as soon as we get the final things, which should be anytime in the next month or two, we will go out and we'll have, a bunch of people to certify at once.
Okay. So could you talk a little bit about how certification impacts a business positively in terms of protecting them? And like you had mentioned earlier about product recalls, even brand integrity, even just from an operational standpoint.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, it's all over. I mean, and you can really look at it for any way. I really am eager to have data on this that's specific to this industry. So, but when you can look at data from ISO, of their certifications of what is an ISO 9001 management system certification, and there's really good data out there. But as far as for focus, what we're really doing is making sure that they've got all their ducks in a row, that they're not going to jeopardize their license or any fines or fees for, poor behavior or non-compliance, that they are providing a safe and healthy workplace for their employees, that they're not going to end up with any accidents and slips and falls and lawsuits around that, that they're making safe, quality, consistent products. And I think that's where, personally to me, where it's such a big deal, but people don't get it on that part yet. So they see it more from the risk management and the business stuff, but there's not really a national brand leader in this space, right? There's definitely big companies that are MSOs, but none of them have a brand that is, across the nation there. And I think that's because they can't make the same product every state because they've got all different operations, right? So if you think about, I waited tables and bartended when I was in college and high school, and I worked, for Fridays at one point, and they needed somebody from us to go up to another Fridays in Vegas and open that one. What do? You take your team You take your business model and you go do it, but you can't do that in cannabis because the laws are different. And so that's one of the real big benefits to standards is like you get everything done, you get your operations in place for one facility, and then you go, I can move it over here. Will there be little tweaks due to the regulations? Like might have to store documents longer. Yeah. But it's so straightforward comparatively because you literally just copy and paste your documents, realign them for that facility and stuff. So the idea is to make scaling and all of that easier. I think really that whole product safety, quality, and consistency is the biggest part. But because there's not been a big lawsuit yet, really. I mean, there's been a couple consumer lawsuits, but nothing that's really hurt too much. None of the big ones like, was it Bluebell ice cream they had recently and stuff. So and they're going to happen, right? I mean, eventually they're going to come not only back on the operator, but whoever sold that product, whoever made that product, whoever distributed that product, and some point on the state too.
Yeah. Well, did you have an influx of inquiries during the vape crisis last year or 2019? Where there was the okay.
Well, we had a lot of inquiries from states, right? Because they would find products that were contaminated, that were legal, that had been tested. And they're like, how can this be? Testing, we test everything. And it's like, yeah, but you don't actually test everything. You touch batches. And that's the whole problem with relying solely on testing.
Okay.
So, but we didn't get a lot of client directly, if that was what you were asking. I mean, we are pretty steady with business because we don't do any paid marketing or advertising. At first it was a function of cash, right? We just started without a lot and I didn't want to spend the money on that. And then once we were able to, we've tried it a couple times, but what we find is this is not like every cannabis operator is not our client. The right cannabis operator, the right client for Focus understands the value of what we provide. They understand that it will be work and a headache to do it and get it there, but they know that the value forever will be there once they do it. And so what happened when we were publicizing about this, we get a ton of people that would call in, but they just basically want certification because they want a stamp on their product.
Right.
Don't really care about the whole backhand, all the work that goes into that, right? And that's just not what we're here to do. And we find that word of mouth, doing things like this, when I'm lucky enough to have opportunities to do interviews and podcasts and stuff, it's a much better way because people, it will either resonate or it won't, right? And it may resonate and they're not ready. So we get a lot of that. People will call, want to talk, we'll have a good hour-long conversation. They're like, I'm not ready yet. We never push anybody. We've not had any client not come back yet. So it's a big decision and we realize that and we want to do everything we can to make it easier for you, but it's impossible for me to sell that through an ad.
Oh, I understand that.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of partners, could you talk a little bit about your partnership with Green Flower and how you've worked with them in terms of training and developing curriculums?
Yeah, for sure. We're super excited. That was just last year. COVID has I can't have any time.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Time's not real anymore.
I know it's slowly. We're super excited about that. So initially when we partnered with Green Flower, we were asked to build some courses for the food and drug professionals. And we were looking for a partner to do the technology side with us. And so that was how we started working with Green Flower, is we brought them into our relationship with the Association of Food and Drug Officials. And we took 28 food safety courses that the FDA has created and keeps online for regulators, and we made them cannabis safety courses. So that was the beginning of it. But now we're in the process of building a bunch of focus training and putting training centers for regulators based on the standards. Focus is kind of morphed and grown just naturally. So like we do, bankers love us because we give you insight into an operation, what's happening, not just what documents they submit. Insurance underwriters love us because we know what the risks are better than anybody, and we can help them, with determining premiums. They adopt the standards and use them as the baseline for premiums and measuring risk and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know if that.
As you continue to morph and evolve, what do you see? What's next for Focus? And specifically, I always like to ask, what is your prediction for other states coming online, or even at a federal level?
So Focus is an easier question. We are finishing up our ISO accreditation. We will begin updating the standards in Q2. So we're going to start recruiting committee members again. It won't be nearly as big of a project. We don't expect it to take more than a few months just to update the existing standards. But at the same time, we're going to start developing some other standards. So one for insurance, one for banking. I think we're going to try one. It's still in the works, but for like caregivers and home grows, just to give them some guidance. Obviously, it's not the same level as what a pharma grade facility or even just a cannabis facility would be, but be helpful for them to have something too. So that's next. And then I think we've got a couple contracts with insurance companies now. Looks like there's a few more that would like to do that. So we may end up starting the cannabis risk management through Focus, like as a branch or an arm, but I don't know. We'll see. I don't want to be everything.
Well, I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask is I'm just impressed with the alphabet soup that you work with. And then you're also you have a database and you're managing documents for the people that are working towards standardization. That is an incredible amount going on.
It is a lot. I will say that. And I have a great group of people around me that help and get things set up. But it's kind of a good example of how I can do that, is why somebody should do Focus certification, right? Because by putting the systems in place up front, getting the document management system there, the client, there's a process for it. The client gets the email with the instructions, they upload it. My team knows how to review it. It doesn't hurt, right? Like it does if I had to manually go in and do everything. And that's the whole point of certification, is to make your business efficient and run better. So there's a lot of, Lean Six Sigma and lean manufacturing kind of stuff in there that it really, benefits business wise too. But yes, I'm overwhelmed and need help for sure.
How big is your team?
Right now we are 6 internal full-time.
Oh, right on.
We've got contractors, around, and obviously we've got auditors and consultants all over around the world that do that kind of stuff too.
When you had mentioned it earlier about people sometimes pushing back with regulation, like I find it's kind of a mix. Like when I talk to people, a lot of them have experience prior to it being legalized, and they're stepping into the legitimate side of the business, and they want to keep that sort of Wild West feeling in terms of how they operate, but they also want it to be legit, and sometimes that causes a conflict.
Yep.
So, I mean, do you run into that a lot, where they're just like, people want to run to regulation, but they're also like, whoa, back off?
Yeah, I mean, I think you get more of the hesitancy, at least in this space, right? But that's kind of where the understanding is. I mean, standards are built to help an industry. They are not there to overregulate. And if you look at other industries, I mean, standards always come before regulation. So, and a lot of times they end up being the regulation. So standards are a way for the industry to participate in what that says, right? And what goes in there. People still are afraid of it. But I think that comes from a disconnect of thinking the same of regulations and standards. So standards guide regulations, standards help the business owner, right? So what they should be running to is standards, because there's enough. Standards are designed to be, let me see if I can say this right, because I always mix it up, broad enough to cover what anybody's doing, and specific enough to control those processes. So a client's or company's IP and individual practices and all the things that make up their sort of secret sauce, whether that's their secret sauce culture or product or, operation, whatever, can all still remain with a company that's certified. We don't need to change that. We don't want to. We want to figure out what you're doing and make sure that you're doing it well and protecting your business. We're not here to say, oh, you can't have cannabis leaves on your on your employees' shirts, or you know what I mean, anything like that. It's not a regulation. It's how do we do this within your business to make sure that you and your bottom line are protected and your employees and stuff.
So a lot of our readership, we like to cover the industry from, as a trade publication, the equipment side of the business. And we're seeing more and more equipment being designed specifically for the industry. Do you have any are any of the standards where that's part of it, where they need to have specific equipment designed for the industry, or, does it get into those details?
It does. We cover equipment for sure. We do not specify a manufacturer or even a type. And the way I'd have to look. The standard for cultivation alone is like 75 pages, but they need to have an industrial hygienist, a certified industrial hygienist, sign off on their equipment.
Okay.
So if they bought all the individual pieces themselves and put together, that's okay, but you just need to get an industrial hygienist to come in and sign off on it. If they bought a ready-made extraction from Waters or Eden or whoever, then those come already validated and certified, right? So we just need to walk through and make sure that the way you set it up is proper.
What's an industrial hygienist?
Not me.
Yeah, right. You'll have to find one to ask.
Yeah, I mean, they're literally certified engineers in industrial and hygiene to make sure that your equipment does what it's supposed to do, that it's cleaned okay, that it flows properly, all that.
Okay.
It is certainly not me.
But
it's a really good question.
The other thing I wanted to ask that I seem to get a lot at trade shows is the issue, especially from packagers and labelers, is that there is no regulation and there is no standardization around labeling. Is that coming around, and where could people go to find sort of like one specific place to find where the correct labeling for every state? Does that exist?
No, because every single state has different labeling requirements, which is the challenge, right? And so what we did, rather than specifying sizes and shapes and all of this, we just specify content, and then it can be however the state wants it. But yeah, I had a friend of mine ask me on LinkedIn the other day to send her a label. I'm like, we don't like labels. We don't, it's something that I actually wrote down on our kind of, sideboard to say, maybe we should publish one just based on our standard, what it says, so people can at least see it. But it's not, we don't tell, they're not prescriptive, right? You have to meet this, but we don't tell you how to meet it. So that's why we don't.
Okay.
But I think you're right. I think that's something needed. And we hear about it a lot too. And especially when you see, the Farm Bill, like with that legalizing hemp, it's changed everything, you see all these companies getting called for packaging and labeling and getting letters and all this stuff and fines. And so it's much more of a big deal now that the feds are involved on that side, which is why they care more, right? Yeah. It's a good lesson for the marijuana side of this industry, because I can tell you when the Farm Bill passed, we were probably, before it passed, 90% marijuana companies, maybe 93, 94 even. That did a complete 180 in the year after the Farm Bill, because all of a sudden all these hemp clients are like, oh, we have to meet all these federal regs. How do we do this? We can't sell product. We're losing business every day that we don't have, our business in order and don't have the certification and blah, blah, blah. So that it's not something that you can do overnight. So it was a good, kind of lesson that way. But I think that the packaging and labeling is, how do I say this? I don't want to sound rude. Whatever you write on your label, the more important thing is what's in your product.
Okay.
So if people got down to what exactly, and did the science and did the studies to figure out what exactly is in their product and what's the shelf stability, there wouldn't be so much ambiguity about what to put, right?
Right.
Some of the nomenclature would be questioning. But so for us, we're way more concerned about that product being made safely. It's not going to hurt anybody or make them sick. It's going to work the same from time to time so people can rely on it as medicine. Then the labeling comes. It's the same. And that's just a focused perspective. It's not to say that that's the right order or anything. I had to make the same decision, early on when we started this. People would say, well, are your standards for medical or adult use, right? And my point was, I don't really care why they're using it. I don't want it to make them sick, right? They deserve, it's a consumer product. They deserve to, know what they're getting and have it be safe. Same thing with why don't we create a dosing standard?
Yeah.
Well, that would be terrific, but you got to make the product the same over and over and over to be able to get a dose anyway. And I just didn't feel like the industry was there yet.
Well, thank you very much for taking your time today. And I want to say, I apologize if you heard it, but like we've normally operate in the quietest space in Madison, and they've decided to tear the building down next to us. So I apologize if you've heard it.
I haven't heard it at all. Don't worry. I'm moving. I've got nothing on my walls right now or anything else. So
yeah, it's just like, really? Are you taking the entire building down? No. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, or anything in particular that we might have left out that would be pertinent to the CEN audience?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I appreciate it. We're here to help. We've got somebody answers chats and phone calls all the time. So call us if you have questions.
Excellent.
We're nice people. We'd love to help you.
Well, thank you very much, Lezli. I really do appreciate it today.
Yeah, it was fun. Thanks, David. It was a good time.